So in previous patches, when it came to picking a weapon in Monster Hunter, we could make one of two decisions. We could pick an elemental weapon, which had the highest possible damage, but could be pretty useless. You sort of had to pick the right weapon for every single monster. Or you could pick a status weapon, which was good in all situations, but never really hit the same heights as an elemental weapon. It was sort of a jack of all trades. And now, in Title Update 2 of Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak, we do not have to make that choice. They gave us a weapon with fire and poison, element and status, and it is just as broken as it sounds. This is the new best longsword in Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak. But yeah, hi everyone. If you don't know me yet, I am Ralph. I am a physicist who plays way too many video games, and here on YouTube, I like to look at video games with like this sort of scientific engineering analytical perspective and mindset. In Monster Hunter, I have created a Python script that iterates through millions, billions, way too many combinations of weapons, armor, decorations, rampage skills, augments, everything, to find the best possible builds against every single monster, and here I am reporting this all to you. Before we get into all the builds, if you just want to see one and what I think is the best one, you can see this on screen right now. But before I go to the builds, what's actually new in this patch? What do we actually need to consider when we try and make our own builds, if you can't reach these or if you just want to see what's cool? So the main thing that really shakes up the meta is this new longsword, the Kaktus Himmel, the flaming Espinas longsword. I think this weapon's name means like cactus sky or something. I don't know, I don't speak German. But so, what's good about it, what's bad about it? So the first thing you might notice is it only has 300 raw, which is actually pretty mediocre. It's not really that good at all. But on the flip side, it does have natural purple, which is always nice, and a pretty decent amount of white, so you don't really need to add any more sharpness to it. And also gets pretty nice armor slots, with 1 3 slot and 2 1 slots. It's not great, but it's still pretty good. It also has 3 rampage slots, so you can put in any rampage skill you want. But where it starts getting good is, well, it has 20% affinity, which is actually really, really nice. It means we don't need to fit in as many skills. It has 43 fire, which is nice and above average. And it also has 28 poison, which is also nice and above average. But no weapon until now has had both fire, an element, and a status. And they both really, really boost your damage. If you might recall from the last patch, fire especially is really, really good because there's really good gear that increases your fire damage. There's Silver Soul Mail, which gives you fire attack 3, and critical element, which is very, very efficient at 1 point. What makes it even better now, what makes status even better now, is a new skill called the Buildup Boost. This is probably the most important damaging skill that they've added in this patch. What Buildup Boost does is it gives you extra raw when your attacks deal status damage. So for raw weapons, you're going to deal status damage 1/3 of the time if you have a status weapon. So basically you can just divide these numbers by 3 if you want to think about how much damage you actually boost. But if you do divide those numbers by 3, even at level 1, you get a 3% attack boost just from one skill, which is absolutely massive. This makes status weapons much, much stronger on average than other options. And you get this from the new Risen Chameleos monster at MR 110. But yeah, so if you can get this skill, if you can put the skill on, it is really, really good if you have any status at all. So the fact that the new longsword has any status at all means you can use this build-up boost skill, it can use critical element, and it can boost its damage by a lot with both status boosting and element boosting skills at their highest efficiency. But not only that, they added extra things that further boost the damage of status. So we've always had this skill called Chameleos Blessing, which has bonus effects depending on what level it is. Levels 1 and 2 don't really matter so much for longsword. Level 1 increases the effects of Spirit Bird sometimes. Level 2 gives you resistance to wind pressure, but if you're using longsword, wind attacks are just an excuse to counter, so it's not a big deal. But Chameleos Blessing 3 doubles the duration of your poison, which basically doubles your poison damage. Poison damage is actually pretty significant. So this skill has always been in the game, you just needed the Chameleos armor, which wasn't very good. But now they add a jewel, the Haze jewel, which grants 1 point of Chameleos blessing. And fitting in 1 point skills is still relatively easy, which means you can very easily now just double your poison damage, which is massive. What's super nice also is that one of the Chameleos pieces has Chameleos Blessing also has the previously mentioned Buildup Boost. So you don't even need 3 1 slots, you only need 2 1 slots to get Chameleos Blessing 3. And all of this works together just to make that Flaming Espinas Longsword so good. But yeah, there's also other nice things that they added. So weapons now get 6 augment slots up from 5, so this does change every other build. I've recalculated every other build, and they'll come up later on. The main big thing that is changing is that before with 5, you could use 2 slots for raw and 3 slots for affinity. Now, basically that meant that you sort of had to make a choice between 5 raw and 5 affinity, and usually you picked affinity. But now with 6 augment slots, we can put all 6 slots to raw, and then it becomes a choice between 10 raw or 5 affinity. The 10 raw usually wins now, so usually you're going to go max raw in most situations. So that's a big change from augments. There's a new arm piece from Violet Mizitsune, the Onmyo Teko, which is quite good. It gives Agitator +2, which is a nice bonus. And also has 3 2 slots. And it also has some other nice decorations that are added as well. There's a new Chain Crit Jewel. Chain Crit was always super efficient at 1 slot, and now you can use it with a 2 slot jewel. They also renamed the skill to Burst, interestingly enough. But also there's some nice 4 slot skills. So we now have a Maximize jewel. We have Element Attack jewels, and we have Handicrafted jewels at 4 slot, which are all really nice. But yeah, without further ado, that is basically the main changes. They added a few extra things that aren't really too important from a build making perspective for Longsword. And for the rest of this video, I'm going to also, just for what it's worth, not assume we are not using Curio augments for armor. If you do, I made a list earlier of what your priorities are if you do get to pick random skills. But I'm going to revisit this at a later point once I finish Lance builds and whatever else. So yeah, full Curio armor builds are going to come later. For now, this is just Curio armorless builds. But yeah, so build time. So if we don't want to use any element at all, the best build is a poison build using Wyvern, Blade, Luna. Let me just cut to that. There we go. Yes. So again, the main big benefit so there are 2 big benefits that poison has. So you have those Risen Mizuha sleeves, the Risen Chameleos arms, which gets you that skill Buildup Boost, which is a free 3% raw. And also we fit 2 Haze jewels, Chameleos Blessing jewels, which doubles our poison damage, so we double our raw. And yeah, so this is now the second best longsword after the Flaming Espinas longsword. If an enemy is immune to fire, this is probably going to be your way to go. As for the fire poison ones, so we have 3 fire builds that I'm going to talk to you about, depending on how fire weak an enemy is. So this is the build that has the highest possible element. You can see it has 5. We're going to use 5 slots for element for the weapon, and in general, just everything is prioritized towards maximizing the element. We get a nice Silver Soul Mail to get fire attack 5. We get 1 point of element exploit. We get 3 points of chain crit, and we can still fit 3 points of Chameleos Blessing. That's the really cool thing about this. So the Silver Soul Mail really increases your elemental damage, and the Risen Mizuha sleeves really increases your status damage, and we can fit both with this weapon, which is great. Yeah, so you can see the build-up boost as well there. And remember that when you are using Mail of Hellfire in these builds, you're generally gonna want to keep on the red Mail of Hellfire to increase your raw damage. The second fire build is this. This is more of a middle ground between element and raw. So you can see that the Curio ends up getting 2 raw and 4 element. And yeah, it's mostly similar We have fewer points of chain crit, just because chain crit also boosts the element. Trading that for, I believe, more attack boost. Yep, so now we have attack boost 4 with this build. Yeah, and a whole lot of skills. And again, we still fit critical element, and we still fit Buildup Boost. And we still fit Chameleos Blessing 3. These are super important damage boosting skills now for this weapon. And finally, we have a low fire build, which you can see now. So this one does not use the Silver Soul Mail. We instead swap things around just to make sure we get more points of attack boost and things like that. This is good if an enemy has just slight weaknesses for fire. It ends up being better than the Wyvern Blade Luna, and better than the same weapon with higher elemental stats. All that being said, it's still worth mentioning that there are still some niche situations where element is still going to be good, especially when monsters are super weak to non-fire elements. A good example of this is the Abyss Bringer Blade, the Water Longsword, which still has really high element, and thus is really good against monsters that are super weak to elements, super weak to water, like Flaming Espinas, like Volvidon, if you have trouble against Volvidon, and like, there's one more example, like Pyre Ragnar Kadaki. So this build is just fully spec'd out for element. We have things like maxed out water attack, we have element exploit, we have chain crit 3, and we have critical element 3, along with really high affinity. And yeah, so this one's really good. For thunder, we're going to use the Oppressor's Abyss, and there are going to be 2 thunder builds. We have one that has really high element and is good against monsters that are super weak to thunder, specifically and only Shogun Senator, so we're not going to spend too much time on this. The more reasonable thunder build is this one, which is useful in a few more situations and has a nice balance between raw and element. Again, so we have 2 points, 2 augment points towards raw and 4 towards element. And yeah, so this one's good against things like Puke, Cold Rathian is probably the more useful example, and Tigrex sometimes. So yeah, this one is still pretty good. Moving on, we have Ice. We have the Flicker Blizzard Slash as our Ice Longsword. This one's good against quite a few more monsters, because quite a few monsters are pretty weak to ice. So for example, this is good against the Rajangs, normal Ragnar Kadaki, sometimes with Narkuga, great Rogi Diablos, and normal Espinas. So yeah, again, really spec for element. 5 augment points in the Curio weapon, element exploit, maxed out a chain crit element, and all of that. Now for Dragon, our last element, we're going to use the Street side still, and this specific one has pretty decent element, pretty decent dragon, and it's good against quite a few monsters, so mostly Geismagorm, the Wraths, and for Thunder Serpent Narwhal, we're going to use this build, which has slightly higher raw and slightly lower element, just because Narwhal is pretty resistant to poison, and Dragon's still pretty good against it. But yeah, so you might notice, if you pay attention to previous builds, that the variety of elemental weapons has gotten a lot smaller. We've lost quite a few longswords to the power of the poison weapons. So we don't use Moonbrand Luachea, the Ice Longsword anymore, we don't use Shock Strike and Thunder Longsword, and we don't use Red Flash, a Dragon Longsword. There are fewer and fewer element options just because the Fire Longsword is so strong. But yeah, now outside of the elements, there are still a few nice off-meta status options, which all got buffed as well by the power of Buildup Boost. So if we move on, we can talk about Blast. So there are 2 Blast Longswords worth mentioning. The main basic one is Devil's Deal, which you get from Scorned Magmala. You can see this one has the Risen Mizuha sleeves for the plus 3% damage, but we don't get the benefit from Chameleos Blessing. So we get Speed Sharpening plus 3 instead. But yeah, so this is really good if you just want to use Blast, if you want to break parts. It's also does pretty well against Thunder Serpent Narma. Possibly better depending on how much damage you do via other means like the cannon and whatever else. Now, slightly better than this build, I think, is the Blast Grinder build. So this is the build that you're going to use if you want to use Grinder. Same weapon, if you can keep up to 50% uptime, this is better than the last one. And with really, really high uptime, with like 100% uptime, it's better than the Dragon one against Narwa. But yeah, if you want to use Grinder, just use this one. As for the other statuses, we have the team support statuses, as I could think of them. So we have Sleep. So this is a good sleep longsword. If you just want to maximize your sleep, the Nightmare Frilled Slash. And if you want to trade off for a bit more damage, you can use the Antique Machina LS. I'd probably use the Nightmare Frilled Slash because if you're going to use sleep, you're probably going to actually want to sleep the monster more. We also have a Paralysis Longsword, the Spirit Binder, but this one does so little damage, I honestly wouldn't recommend it. And finally, for completion, I guess, we also have this boring baseline raw one, but don't use this, don't use this. I'm going to go back just to make sure we mostly use the Kaktus Himmel, the Fire Longsword. But yeah, those are basically all the builds, and you should be able to see on screen right now the best weapons against each monster, depending on your playstyle. So this is the first batch, here's the second batch, and the main conclusion summary that I wanted to emphasize is that now Poison is really, really strong in this new title update. Partly because you've got new weapons, partly because you've got Buildup Boost, improving our raw damage by about 3%, and partly because we have the Haze Jewel, because we have Chameleos Blessing, which doubles our poison damage. So yeah, Poison is really, really good. And Element relatively went worse, but can still be optimal in a few matchups. For the most part, the Kaktus Himmel, the Flaming Espinas Longsword, is now the best longsword. It has the best of both worlds. It has great element, it has great status. And yeah, it is the weapon to go. So yeah, thank you all for watching. That's basically it for this video. Like and subscribe. Next video, I will be looking through the Lance builds. I'll hopefully get that done by Monday or Tuesday. And then I'm going to talk about the Curio Augments, the actual best ways to use Curios for things like that. And yeah, hope to see you all next time. You might have a few weird videos from me in the next few weeks as well. But yeah, bye.